Good evening, the gathering at Scott Memorial. This is Pastor Stephanie. Tonight we are looking at Christ on the Sea. But first, some announcements. We had a building renovation update today, but if you have any questions, feel free to email myself or Robbie. Next week we will do Promotion Sunday and Blessing of the Backpacks. And then next Sunday after church, we will have a church security team meeting. Check your email for more wonderful announcements. So now back to the sermon. So I love going to the beach. It's not summer unless I have gone to the beach. And I grew up going to the Outer Banks and just love being at the beach. There's something for me so powerful about seeing the ocean. The ocean reminds me of my place and reminds me of how powerful God is. Growing up, I loved to boogie board. And of course, sometimes you didn't quite catch the wave right and you would tumble, right? And especially when you're small and the wave seems so big, there's nothing quite like tumbling and not knowing which way is up, getting caught in the wave and kind of just feeling disoriented. And it just always has a way of making you remember that you are small. And how you also just come out with sand everywhere. And then growing up in the Outer Banks too, going to the Outer Banks, rip currents are famous for the East Coast, and a couple times got caught in rip currents, and it is quite terrifying to be out in the ocean, think that you're not too far from shore, look out, and suddenly you're much farther than you planned. So the ocean has a way of reminding us that we are not in control. We are just small, and that God is the one who is in control. So for this week and next week, we will be looking at stories by the seashore. Many of us go to some sort of ocean. Good to see you, Kendra. So some of us go to the beach or a lake or a river as a way to refresh and enjoy the summer. So we will be looking at several of those stories. Now, starting in 2 weeks, we will be doing a 9-week sermon series on the Enneagram, and I'm so excited that we're going to be doing this. So the Enneagram is kind of a Christian personality test that helps us to see what our sins are. So each personality, there's 9 of them. Each personality type has a specific sin. Now we all wrestle with all the sins, but specific sins that we fall more prone to. And so Robbie and I will be sending out an email to the congregation, letting you know, letting you have a test, take a test, to kind of figure out what Enneagram you are. But I have found it so helpful as I've been doing research of knowing why people tick and how they tick and be like, oh, that's why this person does this. So stay tuned for more. But tonight we are looking at a story on the seashore. So our scripture for tonight comes from Matthew chapter 8, verse 23 through 27. When Jesus got into the boat, his disciples followed him. A windstorm arose on the sea, so great that the boat was being swamped by the waves, but he was asleep. And they went and woke him up, saying, Lord, save us, we are perishing. And he said to them, why are you afraid, you of little faith? Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a dead calm. They were amazed, saying, what sort of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him? Now, storms are can be quite scary. In the children's message today in worship, I asked the kids if they were scared of storms, and many of them were honest. I don't know about you all, but where I happen to live in Virginia Beach, we have had crazy storms. It seems like for the past several weeks, but especially this past week, every single evening, afternoon, night, we have had crazy storms run through. It's not just the lightning and thunder and the rain, but the wind. That's the winds that gets me. And so we've had patio furniture flipped over or plants flipped over, not quite where we left them. And these storms are quite powerful. There's nothing also like being in a hurricane or being out to sea as well. Remember, the disciples are out to sea. The disciples were not in a nice boat. Don't think of like a nice aircraft carrier, though I'm sure it's still terrifying to be on an aircraft carrier in the midst of a hurricane in the ocean or a big storm. But the disciples are in a pretty primitive boat. Probably not like something we would ever imagine ourselves getting into. And so they were in the Sea of Galilee, and the Sea of Galilee is known for storms just kind of popping up. And so likely the disciples, they went out and it was a wonderful, calm day. And then suddenly the storm came out of nowhere, descended upon them, and they find themselves terrified. Remember, Christ is asleep on the boat. But yet the boat was being swamped by the waves and Jesus was asleep. And so the disciples are so terrified that they go and wake Jesus up, saying to him, "Lord, save us, we are perishing." And Jesus said to them, "Why are you afraid, you of little faith?" And so Jesus got up, rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a dead calm. And they were amazed, saying, "What sort of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" So remember, the disciples are good Jewish, Hebrew young men. They were young men. So they knew the stories of the Old Testament. So all Jewish boys, when they were growing up, memorized the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, but they also knew all the other scriptures. They didn't memorize all of them, but they knew the other scriptures. And so they knew some powerful stories that we're going to look at that reminded them and told them that it is God who commands the sea. So the first one that we're going to look at comes from the book of Exodus. So remember, Moses had led the Israelites out of slavery, finally convinced Pharaoh through the Passover to release them. And so here they are fleeing for their lives from Egypt. As we're told in Exodus 14, the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the Israelites who were going out boldly. And so as they drew near, the Israelites look back and they see the Egyptians and these nice chariots, this army coming upon them, and they are terrified. They begin to question Moses. "Why in the world did you send us out here just to die?" But Moses trusts that God has a plan. So we're told in verse 21 of Exodus 14, "Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on dry land, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and chariot drivers. At the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and cloud looked down upon the Egyptian army and threw the Egyptian army into panic. He clogged their chariot wheels so they turned with difficulty. The Egyptians say, 'Let us free from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt.'" So they are able to experience this powerful time when God parts the waters, forming a wall of water and dry land for them to get through, and even clogs up the chariot wheels of the Egyptians who are pursuing, who finally just give up. So remember, the disciples knew these stories that God had parted the water. But that's not the only time God parted the water. Another time is in Joshua. So Moses passes away. He is able to see the promised land, but he doesn't quite make it there. And so Joshua is the one who takes over. So remember, they wandered for 40 years. So others had passed on too. They'd heard this story of God parting the waters as they were fleeing from the Egyptians, but they hadn't seen it. Some of them hadn't seen it, or maybe they'd forgotten how powerful it was. So God tells Joshua that he is going to lead Joshua to the promised land. And so Joshua sends spies and sees it. However, it is occupied. It's not just blank land with nobody in it. There are people inhabiting this promised land. And God, as you might imagine, Joshua is a little taken aback. This is not as easy as he'd hoped. And so he is told by God, "Be strong. I will not forsake you. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall put this people in possession of the land that I swore to their ancestors to give them." So Joshua feels powerful and feels like, okay, God is with him. And so they come to the river Jordan. And this is from Joshua chapter 3, verse 14. "When the people set out from their tents to cross over the Jordan, the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant were in front of the people. Now the Jordan overflows all its banks throughout the time of harvest. So when those who bore the ark had come to the Jordan, and the feet of the priests bearing the ark were dipped into the edge of the waters flowing from above stood still, rising up in a single heap far off at Adam, the city that is beside Zarethan, while those flowing towards the sea of Erethath, the Dead Sea, were wholly cut off. Then the people crossed over opposite Jericho. While all Israel was crossing over in dry land, the priests who bore the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan until the entire nation finished crossing over the Jordan. And so once again, God parts a river. Remember, there aren't bridges to go over these rivers. So God parts the water and makes a way so that they can descend upon, excuse me, Jericho. But again, that's not the only time. Again, in Jonah, we were able to look at Jonah a few weeks ago, and Jonah is told by God, asked by God to go to Nineveh to preach to them essentially repentance. And Jonah does not want to. So instead, he goes to Tarshish, the exact opposite way, and on a boat. So he happens to get on a boat. But we're told the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea. Such a mighty storm came upon the sea that the ship threatened to break up. So pretty powerful storm. Again, not the type of boat we're used to, but even on a nice boat, it can feel like the boat is going to break apart if you're in the midst of a storm on the water. So the mariners were afraid, and each cried to his God. They threw the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it. Now Jonah had gone down into the hold of the ship and was fast asleep. But the captain came to him and said, "What are you doing sound asleep? Get up, call on your God. Perhaps the God will spare us a thought so that we do not perish." So remember, Jonah is the only Hebrew on the ship. All the other ones worship other gods. And so they are so desperate that they're like, "We do not care who your God is. Cry out to your God because we are so desperate. Whoever will save us, we will be grateful." And so it is discovered that Jonah is the reason for this storm. And so Jonah finally convinces them to throw him overboard. And so they picked Jonah up, we're told in chapter 1, verse 15. So they picked Jonah up, threw him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord even more, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. So again, these people who do not believe in our God suddenly believed in our God because they saw that the raging storm suddenly stopped. So it is God and God alone who is able to command the waters, part the seas, command the waters. And so the disciples know that it's not an ordinary man, Jesus is not an ordinary man in Matthew 8, who can make the crazy storm stop, who can rebuke the winds. So they are amazed. Remember, they've been following Jesus for a little while, but they're still not quite sure. They've heard the rumors that he's the Son of God, but some still think he might be a prophet, and so they're not quite sure. Remember, they experience some doubt, and even Jesus calls them on, "Why are you afraid, you of little faith?" Doesn't say they have no faith, just says you of little faith. And so they know that this man is connected to God because no one else is able to command the seas in such a way. So we know that God has the power to command the waters, the ocean that has the power to break up homes, seeing the destruction after hurricanes. I'm thinking of that hurricane that hit the Gulf Coast of Florida just last year and the destruction that we saw on the news, just homes and complete communities just wiped out from the power of the sea and the wind. God has the power to stop that. Now, the truth is, in our lives, sometimes it's not the outside storms. Yes, there are the crazy storms that blow through Virginia Beach, but it's not just those storms. It's often the storms of life that often just crash all around us. Jesus has not promised that once you accept Jesus Christ, your life is going to be perfect. We know that people we love are still going to die. We know we're still going to have difficult coworkers. We know family members, we're not always going to get along with them. We're going to have disappointments. We're not going to get that job promotion we want, or things aren't going to turn out how we always planned them. But God promises to be with us. Jesus Christ is with us in the midst of every single storm, able to rebuke the winds and give us that sense of calm. Even though the world around us can be crashing, we have the ability to have that sense of peace. All we need is that little faith. Remember, Jesus he does kind of call out the disciples, "You of little faith," but then he still stops the storm. We're reminded a few weeks ago, we looked at that wonderful story of when the disciples and Jesus were in a crowded room and 4 friends break open the roof and lift their friend down so that the friend who is paralyzed can be healed. And so sometimes we as a church community are called to do that. We are called to be those 4 friends who will do literally whatever it takes. We will destroy things, whatever it takes, so that others can be healed. Because as Jesus said to that man, their faith healed you. And so it's such a powerful reminder that we have the power. Our faith has the ability to heal others and give them that sense of peace. So praying for everyone, because we all experience those storms of life. Today during prayer time, we texted a prayer or just texted someone who we knew who is going through a storm of life. Maybe someone who is grieving the loss of a parent or a child or someone or a spouse or someone they love, and it seems like the world is crashing in on them. Maybe it's a friend who is just feels like every time they pick up the phone or read something, it's more bad news for them and their family. Maybe it's someone who recently lost a job. But it's important for us to reach out to others, to those in our network, and make sure they know that they are beloved children of God. So many blessings on us, church family, as we seek to experience that powerful peace that can come from Jesus Christ, that peace that allows us to get through every storm of life. Because the truth is, friends, the storms are going to keep coming until God's kingdom is fully here and peace reigns on earth. We are going to experience storms. So prayer is that together we can get through the storms. That is why God created us in and for community, so that we can support each other through those storms. So praying for all of us that we may be authentic and share when we need and are in the midst of storms and need the support of others. So I'm here for you as your pastor. We are here for you as your church. So praying for you. All right, guys, have a good night.